and we are live. A new episode of Semaphore podcast. I have with me Patrick. Patrick, thank you so much for joining us. And if you can please just go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Darko. My name is Patrick Debois, and most people know me from my work around DevOps and then later DevSecOps. It's been an interesting ride the last 15 years around this, but kind of looking back maybe over my career, I was looking for doing as much jobs as I can and as much different roles and things in my career. So early on, I kind of wanted to be more independent so I could switch easier because at that time it was not, accepted to change jobs so often. So my typical role is like every 3-4 years, I change domain. I've been a tester. I've been a sysadmin. I've been a developer. I've been a mobile developer, done some front end, but I've also done some kind of management, team lead, kind of QA, VP engineering. So I've been around like a lot of pieces in the kind of organization. And I think that's what also led me to understand empathy of the different roles and seeing friction in between the different roles and bring that together. And that's kind of what led me to DevOps eventually. So
yeah, that's great and exciting. And takes courage, among other things, to swim into completely new domain. What you mentioned, yes, there are many things that you bring from the old position into a new one, but still you have to learn a lot. Before we go on, can you tell us a little bit more about the book that you wrote a couple of years ago? And I think that there is a second edition. Am I?
Correct. Yeah. I am noted as an author, so I'm deliberately staying this very neutral, on a book called The DevOps Handbook. But there were a few other authors that helped kind of write the book. I did a lot of interviews with Gene Kim, and we talked together a lot. They did most of the writing, to be honest. I'm not a native English speaker. But a lot of the ideas came from DevOps and DevOps Days that I organized. And then we summarized that into the book, the DevOps Handbook. I think it was important to have some kind of body of knowledge for people to read that. I have a particular stance about manifestos and books and so on. Like early on in DevOps, people ask me, "Oh, do you want to write the manifesto, like an agile manifesto?" And I always said, like, well, what use is it in a way that if you write a manifesto, even if it's short, people don't understand. If you write 10 books like ITIL, people don't understand. So why even bother? And what excites me, and that ties into the previous thing that I told, I always want to do something new. So I'm in it for the learning and kind of that aspect. But as the stories came out from more enterprises and more patterns emerged, I think the book was kind of a summary that was useful to kind of aid to have people find the stories together. But it was also instrumental in helping organizations and enterprises to kind of see that it's also for them, so that they need more kind of maybe a structure or some body of knowledge for because they're facing bigger problems. And I think that book helped. And then the second edition came by, Nicole joined us, and then we had like more data and kind of even more stories that went in the book. People still talk to me about the book. For me, it seems so long ago, but it's definitely been instrumental work at putting like a flag in the sand where people could look at to find like information about it. I would say maybe it's I'm not going to say it's outdated. The patterns are correct and it's still the same. But after many years, organizations have been changing and the problems have been changing the way we see this. So principles apply, patterns apply, but I think the discussion about one big operations group and one big developer group, that kind of has been fading across the industry, indeed.
Yeah. It has, but there are always those organizations that we maybe not touch very frequently.
Yeah.
That still use unbelievable number of like old patterns, and not to mention technologies, but also in practices and organizational strategies and all of that. But yeah, I agree. Okay, then I mean, I guess after your introduction, it should come to no surprise to our listeners that you are diving for quite a while deep into AI and how it relates to the DevOps, DevSecOps, and so maybe also you can give us like when exactly did you started approaching the topic in a team? Based on your words, it seems that you're early adopter of a lot of technologies, and would like just to know how you got in and how journey looked over last, I guess,
Sure.
2 years or so, roughly.
The hook that for me got me interested is actually not that much per se in the IT landscape. So when I was getting a little bit bored, as I always want to learn new things, and there was not a lot of new things to learn in the IT because we're like similar, doing a lot of things the same way. During pandemic, I wanted to automate myself as a speaker in a way, and I had a startup in media where I did like live interaction with TV shows, and we also always had like a presenter. And that led me to the concept at the time about virtual production. So using game engines to kind of set the stage and kind of like track motion of people and kind of bring that whole set more automated. And then included voice. And then that was Unreal Engine, and they released MetaHumans, and that was kind of 3D rendering. And the 3D rendering was hard, and that got a little bit of flavor from AI to help generate the images, to generate the 3D assets, and then the same with automating the voice. So that's kind of how I got into it. So that was, let's say, end of pandemic. And then the whole thing came of first DALI kind of taking the pictures related to this. And then there was like already a little bit of video in there. And then ChatGPT kind of hit. And so finally it came back into more of my home world, which was kind of the SDLC. And then I started like, well, kind of I brought like new information, new knowledge about that other domain, and thought like, hey, this is now something that like really excites me again, something that's really new. And I guess it's always hard to predict in a way that, okay, is technology useful? The same, you could say, the metaverse, right? Was that useful? But I couldn't find let's say, a use case that I could bring into this. But when the whole Chat GPT and OpenAI came, I was like, okay, this is just the impact is so big in every place. And that just fueled my interest. And then I was lucky enough to work for a company that was in the sweet spot of everything from generative AI. There were a content management system that had sales and marketing material. So a lot of text, a lot of content, a lot of documentation. And I helped them guide both to introduce the technology in the product and to also energize the engineers to get more familiar with this. And after that, I kind of went on my own and kind of like now more studying broader than that company in various places on where it could be useful. So that's a little bit in a nutshell my journey. And I feel like every day I'm learning something new, and it has not stopped for a year and a half of every day there's news, which is insane. There's a certain fatigue, which I also understand. But the way that I approach new technology every time is I want to do it myself. I sometimes call this method acting. I need to use it. I need to kind of feel where the issues are. I need to understand the pains. I had the same thing with infrastructure as code. I think I've used all the tools, the CI/CDs, and then I can extrapolate a little bit more where kind of the pain points are, and that's kind of where I'm now at. We've seen an explosion in the developer tools, which is clear. I think the last 6 months, I'm seeing a rise on generative AI more in DevOps and DevSecOps, like the Terraforms and other tools on the rise, which is particularly interesting as well. And code generation is something that I have an interest in how good can we make it. But actually, my main interest is when it fails. So I always say, like, getting things to work in automation is, you can do that fairly quickly. But yeah, dealing with the exceptions and all the strange cases, that's the hard part. So that's a little bit of my focus right now. So I help companies get their pipelines of maybe GenAI products more robust. I work on kind of observability around the tools. So I go in a few different places, and yeah, it's interesting to see where this is going to land for a technology that is undeterministic, which feels weird for a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah. Although DevOps as like an area is blessed with some non-determinism, but which was coming from the network and those kinds of things, and things can go rough there. But this is like a completely new level.
Mm-hmm.
As the code generation, that's something which kind of everyone is like relatively deep into, especially developers and so on. But the area which you mentioned that you are exploring for the last 6 months or so, more in depth, is that relation and how it's used for the DevOps and DevSecOps and those areas. So I would kind of like to double click on that and
Sure.
hear what was there.
Yeah. Well, as infrastructure as code is also code, there's part of that is quite similar. I think the domain space is smaller than generic coding, so we can kind of like have the generation of the Terraform and work from there. It's interesting that whatever language we're using is becoming a little bit less important, because from the kind of code generation, we generate the configs and the Terraform or Pulumi or you name it. So it's almost like we specify what we want, and the language is not being that important anymore. So the specifications, formalities, which is interesting to kind of see. Maybe it's a way to kind of get away from the war of languages or what we want. So it's more of an intermediate language as such. You also see different things in, let's say I'm building a fairly complex Terraform environment. Okay, I have my code, but more and more you see visualization tools pop up, and you could say, well, that's not code generation, but there's an intersection between showing what has been generated and to see the kind of how it is connected. So the AI tools are helping us to also kind of do the visualization in a way, but more important, they are also understanding what is important or the thing you're working on. There was a tool, InfraPilot. I think they kind of went out of business, or they're going out of business. But the concept was that when they visualize this, they only visualize the piece that is relevant to your change. So kind of that is reducing cognitive load by understanding the context in which you're working, together with the text you're doing, the visualization you're doing, and kind of working from there. The other thing that you see in that generation is there's a lot of questions about how do we validate actually the code generation. Currently, a lot has been left to the end user. to kind of, is just a better completion or a more intelligent completion. But you start seeing more linters happening, which is, general something you do in coding. But the more it becomes like executable things, that requires some infrastructure, some containers, some more microservices that work together. So that is becoming more complex, and that brings it again to relation of the DevOps. When you're testing a Terraform, yes, you can check the syntax, but how do you kind of go from there? I like the concept from System Initiative that is kind of dealing with a digital twin. So if you hook up a digital twin with the tooling, that's something that could actually resonate or reason, I should say, around like what is the impact or what is it doing around that. So while it is code generation, it is just a little bit of a different slant on how we deal with these kind of languages there as well. It is quite interesting that to do this autonomously, like there's a lot of skepticism. Like, yeah, you can't just go to production. And I agree, it is not like the technology inherently is unpredictable. So there should always be kind of this looking at what has changed. But it's definitely helping us to understand things better. The same example on visualization, using AI to generate actually a graph out of this, not just from the AST, but kind of a more understandable visualization is, if you see that there's certain gaps, or you can't answer certain questions, like what are the kind of the regions on the graph, or kind of the things that I need to know. If the AI can't answer this, there might be something wrong with your specification. So it's kind of like using the AI to question what you've done or what it done itself to see whether it can answer this. So that's another kind of trick people have been using it for. I guess towards production, people have been playing around with this. Even today, I saw somebody said, well, I can now replay every DevOps person with my code IDE. I just SSH out, I take the log, and I ask it what to do. There's a certain truth in here. Like, yes, we kind of do the same. Well, maybe not with an SSH, but kind of a log system or observability system to get the logs in. What I'm still seeing is that there's ironically, again, a divide between the development coding tools and the IDEs with a Copilot and so on, and all the production data. So to get the production data to learn from in the system while you're developing, it is something that I'm still kind of looking for. People do this manually, but that integration has not yet been completely built. And that's kind of interesting. And they think about the feedback loop about running it locally, which is the same as a developer would do, but running this in production, maybe with a feature flag or kind of a feature toggle, kind of understanding what the feedback loop would that be. And that's kind of my progression in the pod is everything around this new Gen AI is about getting more context and people having, they look at their code file, they look at their code base, they look at all the code bases, they look at their Jira, ServiceNow documents, their Slack. That's all the things that they kind of currently the developer tool do. But when you have like incident information and kind of that information, how do you relate this back? And yes, there's tools like that kind of Kubia and others that focus on the production side, but tying the two pieces together is still a little bit of a challenge right now. I can't really explain why this is, but there's again like two different worlds trying to tackle it, different problems, and I hope somehow to find a way to kind of like bring them closer together there as well.
Based on this, while you're speaking about this, I remember some events from history regarding testing and verification, and generally. A side note: I have aside computer hardware. So verification for the hardware, that's another story, and hardware, I think that will be useful also there. But going maybe like 15 years ago, I was in the Ruby community, and there, like, testing was a big deal. It's not a compiled language. You can push something into production that will be caught only in the runtime.
Mm-hmm.
And then that community, which was also a lot about startup and SaaS startups, and everything online, and fast delivery. There was a great testing culture, and there still is, around like test-driven development, behavior-driven, and so on. Roughly speaking, after that really took off, 5 years later or something like that, observability got to another level because the industry was just bigger, there was a need, and so on. And I remember a couple of very interesting conference talks where there was a discussion regarding how much you test and then how you go into the production, and then you have all those metrics, and if you see that people are not making checkouts, you roll back your service. You're not pushing it fully untested, but there is that balance between testing and, okay, let's go into production, detect early, and then potentially go back with various canary strategies and so on. So I'm curious to hear what's your position on that. Okay, we have some Terraform code, it's generated, then we push it to a test cluster, to local instance. Luckily now tooling now is great with containers and Kubernetes, and you can do amazing number of things even locally. And then you want to satisfy certain conditions, in terms of testing. So from that aspect of testing the infrastructure with some existing tools, but also using AI, you can use it to generate it, but to test it also, as you were describing, and do multiple loops and so on. So regarding testing, and that would probably lead us into the observability to some extent, but yeah, curious to hear about that.
Yeah, I think it makes me think of two things. One is there's always been a debate whether you should write tests for your Terraform because it's a declarative language. Well, it was the same discussion with Puppet and Chef. Like, we declare things, that should be like this. And my argument was always like, that is true for the primitives of the language. We shouldn't be testing the primitives. But if you have a certain logic that kind of brings a module together or certain things, that requires still testing, right? So that's kind of one piece that I want to get out there. Generating tests is interesting because the AI can certainly help write the tests, but there's a certain fatigue possibility. Like, are the tests good? Are they complete? Are they not complete? So as you say, this is, I think the last version of Copilot actually looks for tests that are not there and tries to help you on the coverage. So that's one way of kind of dealing with this. But if for infrastructure as code, I think in another podcast, somebody said, well, if you would say, I want an S3 bucket, that's what you put in there. What does it mean? For you, maybe it means it needs to be encrypted at rest, and it kind of needs to be behind the load balancer. So that guessing is hard. But for that, we are able now to write some rules that we say, like, they're requirements, like every S3 bucket should be like this, that should be like that. So that could enhance part of those code generation as a validation step. It's what everybody has maybe as knowledge in their head or in the team or in the company. That's how we do things around here. This is also what you see in the code editors. They're starting to have, sometimes it's called like a .ai file, which basically lists the requirements of the generation in certain words. So I, for example, if I start a project, I have a requirements file, like, this is how I want my Docker file. This is how I want my Terraform. This is how I want my backend, front end. So they're all like technical requirements that I describe, and that kind of helps in the code generation. So that kind of helps a little bit in pinpointing the not very clear question of generate an S3 bucket. but gives that context in there. And from there, you can do some validations as well. And then, as you say, you deploy it. There's observability feedback that you get back. Maybe you capture the state of the environment. So all those pieces people are now doing and copy and pasting manually in there to get that feedback. The closest that I ever saw this happening was actually with kind of Microsoft debugging serverless functions from your IDE, because you can set like a debugging flag of something that executes. You can see all the calls, you can see the tracing. And imagine that you would then say, at this trace in my IDE. Again, we're not there on the tooling. They're still like separated worlds, but that could tremendously help. Even, and that was another discussion I had, was how often is this used? How certain do you need to be? How many users are impacted when I do that change? That is also interesting information. How many errors have you seen in production? So all that context does make sense to make it better in there. As you mentioned, tests. It is astounding in a way that, if you're very used to TDD and writing tests, why people are not writing tests. Over the years, I found that it's mostly a certain maturity level, in a way that if you haven't done this, you have to learn how to do this. And it's actually less about the tests, and it's more about your architecture that needs to be testable, because otherwise you have a lot of frustrations and you kind of give up. So I think if I look back over 15 years of DevOps, we've done to the same transformation. Oh, let's write the automation. Oh, hang on, we're going to have CI/CD to kind of write the tests. Hang on, we need observability to bring in there. And then hang on, we need actually, when it fails, we need resilience. So there was resilience engineering we brought in to kind of design for failure. And in the end, we had chaos engineering because we were not used to dealing with failures anymore. So we had to train for the failures. So the more things get automated, I would say like 20% is the automation, 80% is a preparing for failure. And that is what I assume that we're actually on as a similar path to the AI. Now, maybe the 80% gets a lot easier with more AI tools. With one model checking the other model and helping there, but it's definitely one of those cases that I see it grow. And you already see this now. Developers have a fatigue; they don't understand the pull requests anymore, so they kind of have to learn more. And it is important that you still understand what good looks like on the generation, and mostly that's what the seniors do. So I was a little bit puzzled. What is still the role of the junior? Because a lot of people say, well, now the junior can write professional code. Well, if they're lucky that the AI slot machine generated kind of good code, yes. But if not, well, if they get an error, they try again, and they have a sandbox, that's all good. But if it's more crucial and more subtle, then maybe a senior is more needed. Now, the flip side is, maybe the juniors can become seniors faster by using AI for more learning and training. So that maybe is the compensation that we're getting at. But it is an interesting kind of feedback cycle that the more we generate, the more we just review, the more we kind of have to understand what it does. And the more we actually need, similar to production incidents, situational awareness for us to kind of say what is good and what is bad in there. And so every context that we can use is interested. On the production side, a case that very often comes up is, oh, I want to use AI for my incident response. And of course, you find your runbook, your Slack messages, your everything you have, and then it kind of helps you make a decision on what you need to do to solve. I think where people are still a little bit stuck in their imagination is they think like, oh, so this creates like an incident in my ticketing system. I think the next step would be is that the AI just tries the fix in a safe environment and maybe tries 4 solutions of this and gives you feedback. So you see, there's a lot more you can go from there if you start like having ephemeral environments, a safe environment, feedback systems. Because why are you still doing the copy and paste and the game of telephone while this could just be generated? And that's kind of the path that I think several people are on to see how far this stretches as such.
Yeah, I would say connecting to what you described lastly. Sometimes when we have incidents that end up being really tricky, and let's say we are half an hour into the incident, it's still very hairy and puzzling. We split into breakout rooms, and different people try different strategies. Of course, the parallelism that we can hit there is maybe 3 or 4 tops that we hit when something was really problematic, purely limited by the number of on-call people that are dealing with something. With the AI, if it's like cheap enough and fast enough, there could be 100 threads of AI trying 100 different things if they can test it and then report back. Spend on it 15 minutes, report back, and let's try something.
You already see this pattern with image generation, and I'm not saying it's the same because image is different, but a lot of the tools are when you enter a prompt, they say let's generate 5 images and see which one you like most. Again, this is the similar pattern. Just try a few pods and then bring this back. But still, that's where I think the challenge is. If you become more of an operator, cognitive load, training, understanding, explaining it in your world. So let's say the AI found something for you. I might have to explain this in Pulumi terms for you, in CDK terms for you in another, but it doesn't matter. Like that is just the way that I make it understandable for you to deal with the issue. And that's also, I think, an interesting aspect that I see more and more, that the reviewing, which is now quite often a very dry diff, it needs to be a lot more, or it could be a lot more. Like one of the coding tools I found interesting was Cursor, which is kind of like a Copilot competitor, and had like imagine you introduce a change. They have 3 ways of doing this. One was the traditional diff, a red-green, right, that you see. The second one was a chat explaining the change, like in text of words. But the third one was kind of a mixture in they show you the code, but they replace pieces of code that are not that relevant for you to review right now with the description of what it was doing. So this just reduces like what you need to review and how do you need to review, is similar to what I told on the visual thing. Like if you're always seeing the full picture, you want to zoom in on what you need right now. So those are like subtle ways that I'm seeing AI change or kind of products or how we use the products. And that goes way beyond, it's a simple chat GPT and I copy and paste to bring it in. So that's fascinating to me, how kind of the way we work is just changing in the organization. Not for many yet, but hey, kind of like I like looking ahead, and that's what makes it fascinating.
Yeah, we are still relatively early, although a lot of it feels already mature for various, jobs. In these early phases of technology, the particular tools are very important. There is no bing bang, kind of a thing that solves it all, and question if there will be as such. You mentioned Cursor. That's something that I see people using on the Copilot a lot. In terms of these more like DevOps related tools, maybe in the realm of like the observability, maybe log tracking, alerting, incident, and so on. Are there any tools that are worth an honorable mention, either from open source world or commercial, that you like, or
I like, for example, Stackpack, which was one of the tools, which was around Terraform generation. There's runme.dev, which is around like notebook and kind of runbooks generation. But there is a difference in my head in a way that a lot of AI can be used in observability, but they are more of the statistical AI. So they fall under the bucket of AI ops, which is something that was around before generative AI came there. So I'm not looking too much in those because that is something that is it is useful. I'm not saying that, but it's something that was already there on kind of on prediction of load of or cost or those things. Um, so the field's kind of still emerging, but what you see is that vendors, existing vendors, they are maybe they have a complex query language or a domain language. They're turning this into a generation and more observabilities on kind of writing tools on the AI is also something that's coming up. Like I think Datadog recently announced kind of the prompt tracing, much like API tracing. But that's when you build your own tools, and a lot of people are still trying to build their own tools. So it's not something that is like completely emerged. But everybody's trying to do this kind of on their own. And I haven't seen kind of the tool in the way, but everybody's kind of you see a hint in one tool and something in another tool, and eventually they all will have the same features, but it is something that is emerging.
Fascinating area. So something that would read all our application logs in real time and look at all Grafana charts in real time, like an operator who is sitting. That tool is not around, it seems yet, right?
It is not around. So what's interesting recently, I think it was Anthropic that released a version of their kind of their chat GPT or similar model that is able to look at your screen. So it says like, open your desktop, look at my screen. Now, much of the early versions of those models, the multimodal that look at like images, they were not really that well. They were good at describing generic texts, and maybe like if you have a painting or something that would kind of describe this. What I would think that will happen is you will have more and more specific, smaller models being trained on specific context. Oh, I know the screen is Grafana, right? I've just trained so much to see there. But we also have to understand that it might make more sense to just look at the data through an API than watching the screen, right? But that is another thing. But kind of maybe helping us to find the right things to do or look at on the screen makes sense. I've seen tools that are under the bucket of generative BI, and what they do is, let's say you are a report that is generated today, and in a week you have to do the same reporting for your boss. Like the boss now has to go through and has to understand what are the changes. But those tools actually highlight, hey, you know what, that kind of graph was up and that was that. So kind of that explanation is definitely something useful, maybe compare two states and go from there. While it might take too long to build a whole API and comparison tool, this could be like a shortcut to look at like visual differences and kind of highlighting them out. So can't wait for these tools to exist.
Yeah, yeah. We will have to make another episode maybe in a year or two and just see how big the diff is and how we
Sure.
will make the diff. For people that want to, learn more about your work and follow you, and I know that you're doing numerous presentations and talks, what are some good pointers that you can give us?
I'm currently mostly active on two platforms. I have a YouTube channel under the name handle of Jedi Forever, so you can find me there. Most of my presentations are over there, and for the rest, I am Patrick Debois on LinkedIn. And so if I find new stuff, I mostly share things around there. I don't mind too much, like it has to be all polished, but I like sharing the stuff that I find. And for me, that is getting feedback from people on that. And that is also like one of my learning mechanisms. While I'm learning, I share, and then I get like new learnings back. So that's kind of where you can find me.
Yeah, I understand by now that you like to layer things. So there is a layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and all their own connected in feedback loops. And it's some kind of reinforced learning or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Patrick. It was very exciting exploring this area, which seems to be endlessly deep, and it will just going deeper and deeper and becoming more powerful and powerful. So, yeah, again, thanks so much for your time. It was great talking to you.
Sure. Talk in a year, as we discussed.
Sure.